Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. My name is Sabrina Hartwell, but you can call me Bree. My husband Calvin, who goes by Cal, and I live in the small city of Anderson, nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in upstate South Carolina. When Cal and I first got together a little over a year ago, he owned his own place, a cozy house surrounded by sprawling woods. On the weekends, my two kids from a previous marriage and I would stay at his house, using it as a little getaway. Cal has since moved in with me and the kids full-time, but we still like to go out to his old place when we need a break from the bustle of town. Cal's childhood home, where his mama Bonnie still lives, is right next door to his place. The gravel driveways of the two properties even connect, winding through the towering oaks and hickories like dusty ribbons. It was on my first visit to Cal's that Bonnie pulled me aside, her weathered face serious as a preacher's at a tent revival. "Now, Bree, I know them kids of yours will want to go exploring in them woods," she said, her voice low and solemn. "But you best not let 'em go too far off, especially not near evening time." I raised my eyebrows, curious. Bonnie seemed like a sensible woman, not prone to flights of fancy. "Why's that, Bonnie?" "Copperheads. We have our share of venomous snakes in these parts." She shook her head slowly. "No, honey. Worse than that." She glanced toward the tree line, then back at me, her faded blue eyes holding mine. "Few months back, I was out in the yard tending to my tomatoes. All of a sudden, this thing come tearing out the woods, right past me, not more than 6 feet away." I felt a prickle down my spine, despite the warmth of the afternoon. "What kind of thing?" "It was a cat, biggest damn cat I ever laid eyes on. Size of a full-grown lab, easy. And black as pitch, not a speck of color on it. Now, I've spent my fair share of time outdoors. I knew the Department of Natural Resources didn't officially recognize the presence of mountain lions here, but that was a bunch of bureaucratic hogwash. I'd caught a picture of a tawny cougar on my own trail cam just last fall, but a black one? I'd never heard tell of such a creature prowling the Carolina hills. You sure it wasn't a bear? Or maybe a real big boar? I asked, though I had a feeling I knew the answer. Bonnie fixed me with a look that could curdle milk. "Honey, I've been hunting and trapping these woods since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I know a cat when I see one, and that was a cat sure as Sunday. Moved all slinky and quiet, not like no bear." I nodded slowly, a tingle of unease dancing up my neck despite the bright sunshine filtering through the leafy canopy. "I appreciate the warning, Bonnie. I'll keep a close eye on the kids, I promise." And I did. From that day forward, I made sure my son and daughter never strayed out of shouting distance when they played among the hickories and oaks of Cal's property. Still, I often found my gaze drawn to the silent sentinels of the forest's edge, wondering what else might lurk beyond sight in those green depths. It was about a month after that first unsettling conversation with Bonnie that Cal and I decided to go deer hunting on his land. Our usual sitter had the kids for the day, and we were both thrumming with cabin fever after a long week of work. We gathered up Cal's hunting rifles, pulled on our orange vests and caps, and set off down the winding trail that led to the far corner of his acreage. We walked in companionable silence for a while, listening to the cheerful burble of the birds in the branches above and the skitter of squirrels in the underbrush. The sun-dappled peace of the forest settled over me like a mantle, and I felt myself begin to relax for the first time in days. After about half an hour of strolling and seeing nary a whitetail, Cal stopped in a small clearing and turned to me, a boyish grin lighting up his tanned face. "Hey, Bree, you want to see something real interesting?" I cocked an eyebrow at him. "I suppose that depends on what kind of interesting we're talking about, Cal Hartwell. If you're fixing to show me another dang deer scrape," he laughed, a warm, rich sound in the cathedral hush of the forest. Nah, nothing like that. I want to show you the old Indian burial ground back here." Now that piqued my interest right quick. As a born and raised Carolina girl, I'd grown up hearing tales of the Cherokee and Catawba tribes who once called these hills and hollers home. The idea of seeing one of their sacred spaces with my own two eyes sent a thrill through me. "Well, why didn't you say so?" "Lead the way!" Cal's grin widened, and he took my hand, guiding me off the beaten path into a section of woods I'd never explored before. The trees grew closer together here, their canopy blocking out the bright blue bowl of the sky. A strange, linstery silence settled over us as we walked, the chatter of the birds fading away until all I could hear was the crunch of our boots on the fallen leaves and the rasp of my own breath. After a few minutes, Cal stopped again, his hand tightening on mine. "We're here," he said, something odd in his tone that I couldn't quite place. I looked around, puzzled. At first glance, this patch of forest seemed no different than any other. The same mix of hickories, oaks, and pines, the same dappled sunshine filtering through the leaves to mottle the forest floor. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I began to make out strange shapes, half hidden in the carpet of leaves and pine needles. They were stones, I realized with a jolt. Dozens of them. Some flat and half buried in the rich loam, others jutting up at awkward angles like broken teeth. They were too regular in shape to be natural formations, their edges worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind. "Are these grave markers?" I asked, my voice sounding small and thin in the pressing quiet. Cal nodded solemnly. "Yep, been here longer than anyone can remember. My granddaddy used to tell me stories about this place when I was a boy, said it was powerful old magic." A chill whispered down my spine despite the balmy air. I'd never put much stock in talk of magic and spirits, being a good Christian woman, but standing there among those ancient moss-eaten stones, I couldn't help but feel a sense of presence, as if the trees themselves were watching us with silent, knowing eyes. Overhead, a crow cawed harshly, making me jump. Cal squeezed my hand. "You all right, darling? We can head back if you want." I shook my head, forcing a smile. "No, I'm fine. It's just a lot to take in is all." I gazed around at the old stones, trying to imagine the lives and stories of the people laid to rest beneath them. What had this place been like when they walked the earth? Did their spirits still linger here, watching over their descendants? As if in answer to my unspoken question, a sudden gust of wind rattled through the branches above us, sending a shower of leaves cascading down around our feet. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I had the uneasy sensation that the wind carried whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. Cal cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "I'm going to go check the creek, see if that damn beaver dam is blocking the flow again. You okay waiting here?" I nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Sure, I'll just sit a spell, catch my breath." In truth, the thought of being alone in this strange, silent place made my stomach flutter uneasily. But I didn't want Cal to think I was some silly, scaredy cat. "All right, I won't be long." He squeezed my hand again, then ducked off into the underbrush, his bright orange vest quickly swallowed up by the green. And then I was alone, surrounded by the watchful trees and the restless whispers of the wind. For a few minutes I just stood there, hardly daring to breathe, my eyes darting from stone to stone, as if expecting to see a ghostly figure materialize from behind one. "Get it together, Bree," I muttered to myself at last, blowing out a breath. I was a grown woman, for Pete's sake, not some jittery tenderfoot spooked by a few old rocks. Deliberately, I unslung my rifle and propped it against the nearest tree trunk, then folded myself down to sit cross-legged on the soft carpet of leaves. At first, the peace of the forest settled over me like a calming balm. I closed my eyes, breathing in the loamy scent of earth and decaying leaves, letting the dappled sunlight warm my upturned face. Nearby, a red-tailed hawk screed, the wild sound sending a pleasant shiver through me. This was the kind of moment I lived for, the deep, abiding connection to the land and its non-human residents. But as the minutes ticked by, marked by the distant talking of a woodpecker, a strange unease began to creep over me. It started as a prickling at the base of my skull, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. I shrugged it off at first, telling myself it was just the remnants of my earlier spookiness. But the feeling only grew until it felt like cold worms writhing in my guts. My eyes snapped open, my breath coming faster. The woods looked exactly the same, the beams of sunshine spearing through the greenery, still and peaceful. Nothing moved among the grass and stones surrounding me. And yet, Bree! I jackknifed to my feet, my heart slamming against my ribs. The voice had come from behind me, as clear as if someone had whispered directly into my ear. But as I spun around, my eyes darting wildly, I saw nothing but trees and drifting motes of pollen. Bree! The sibilant whisper came again, from the opposite direction this time. I whirled toward it, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Cal!" I called out, my voice cracking. "That you?" Silence. Even the bird song had ceased, leaving only the rasp of my breathing and the panicked drumming of my heart. "Bree!" This time, the voice came as a screech, the sound slithering down my spine like a razor blade. It sounded close, too close, as if the screamer was right behind me. I spun back around and felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. There, standing not 6 feet away between two of the larger linstry stones, was a figure. It was humanoid in shape, but far too tall and gaunt to be my Cal or anything living. Tattered rags, the color of old moss, hung from its elongated limbs. And its face, dear God, its face. I couldn't make myself look directly at it, my mind refusing to process the glimpse I'd gotten of writhing darkness and too many mouths. A high, thin keening reached my ears, and it took me a moment to realize it was coming from my own throat. "Bray!" The thing whispered again, and now there was a gloating note to its rasping voice, a cruel amusement. It took a slithering step toward me, the rags that shrouded its form fluttering in a wind I couldn't feel. I didn't remember grabbing my rifle, but suddenly it was in my hands, my finger tightening on the trigger as I braced the stock against my shoulder. The creature took another gliding step, stick-thin arms unfolding from its sides, reaching. Bang! The rifle's report cracked through the silent woods like a whip, sending a flock of startled grackles bursting from the canopy in a storm of black wings. The bullet smacked into the center of the creature's chest and passed right through, burying itself in the tree behind it with a splintering thwack. The thing threw its head back, unleashing a gurgling, burbling cry that daggered into my brain like an ice pick. Squinting through eyes awash with tears of pain, I saw the hole I'd blown through its chest seal itself, inky smoke knitting the edges closed. "Bree! Bree, what happened? You okay?" Cal's shout snapped me out of my paralysis. He was crashing back through the underbrush toward me, heedless of the branches that snagged at his clothes. "Cal, run! There's something here I don't—" My voice broke on a sob as the creature whipped its head toward the sound of Cal's approach. For a horrified moment I was sure it would go for him, but then, quick as a blink, it simply unfolded, its spindly limbs collapsing in on themselves like a spider's legs. The moss-colored rags fluttered to the ground in a loose heap, as if they'd never been occupied at all. And then Cal was there, wrapping me in a tight hug, stroking my hair as I shuddered against his chest. Shh, darling, I got you." "What happened, Bree?" "I heard a shot. You see a bear or something?" The genuine bewilderment in his tone made fresh tears spring to my eyes. He hadn't seen it. The thing that had been, mere moments before, close enough to touch. Already the memory of its nightmarish face was beginning to fragment, my mind shying away from the impossible reality of what it had witnessed. I thought I did. But I shook my head helplessly, taking a shaky step back to sweep my gaze around the burial site. The moss-colored rags were gone, not a trace remaining in the carpet of dead leaves. Even the presence I'd felt, that skin-crawling sense of being watched by eldritch eyes, had vanished like dew under the morning sun. If not for the burning afterimage of that final, unraveling moment seared into my retinas, I might have believed I'd imagined the whole thing. Tripped, I finished lamely. knowing Cal would never believe the truth. Hell, I scarcely believed it myself, and I'd seen it with my own fear-widened eyes. Finger slipped on the trigger. Spooked myself good, baby. I tried for a shaky laugh, but it came out brittle and false in the tomb-like hush of the trees. Jesus, Bree, you're shaken like a leaf. Cal wrapped a steadying arm around my shoulders, his warmth seeping into my clammy skin. Let's get you back to the house, yeah? Get some hot coffee in you, maybe a nip of something stronger. That sounds mighty fine, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. I wanted nothing more than to put this place and its whispering stones far behind me, to surround myself with the comforting solidity of walls and honest sunshine, unfiltered by grasping branches. We made our way back out of the woods in silence, Cal supporting me with his solid bulk, but even with his reassuring presence at my side, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us go. Smithing, old and impossibly powerful, amused by our pathetic human frailty. Each skitter of dry leaves in the underbrush made me flinch. Imagining skeletal fingers tipped with jagged nails crept after my heels. It wasn't until Cal's house came into view through the screening pines, Bonnie's battered pickup in the neighboring drive, that I finally allowed myself to exhale. The steel band constricting my lungs, loosening minutely. Cal guided me up the porch steps and into the blessed normalcy of his kitchen, sitting me down at the scarred oak table and busying himself at the ancient coffee pot that burbled on the counter. The familiar, hearty scent of dark roast began to fill the small room, chasing out the dank, rotting smell that seemed to have followed me from the woods. He sat a steaming mug in front of me, the heat welcome against my chilled palms. I took a sip, scalding my tongue, but the pain was grounding, a tether to the physical world after my brush with the inexplicable. "You want to talk about it?" Cal asked after a moment, his hazel eyes worried in his sun-browned face. I shook my head, trying to dredge up a reassuring smile. "No, I think maybe the heat just got to me out there. Low blood sugar or something." The lie tasted sour on my tongue, but what else could I say? That I just had a close encounter with some kind of spirit creature out of a nightmare. Cal would think I'd gone round the bend for sure. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he let it drop, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Well, you just take it easy the rest of the day, you hear? I'll go pick up the kids from the sitter, give you some time to rest." I nodded gratefully. The thought of holding my babies close, chasing away the last lingering tendrils of unease. "Thanks, baby. I don't know what I'd do without you." Cal just grinned, dropping a kiss on the top of my head as he grabbed his keys off the counter. "Ain't never gonna have to find out. I'll be back before you know it." The screen door banged shut behind him, leaving me alone in the suddenly too quiet house. I sat at the table for a long moment, staring into the depths of my coffee mug as if it might hold the answers to the questions whirling through my mind. What in God's name had I seen out there in those woods? And more importantly, what did it want? The memory of that sibilant, gloating whisper slithered through me like dirty ice, making me shudder. I was no expert in the supernatural, but I knew the old stories, passed down through generations of mountain folk. Stories of dark things that lurked in the shadowed places of the world, beings that hungered for mortal flesh and mortal fear. The Cherokee called them raven mockers, the Nunahi, the Ulun-Suti, a branch rapped against the kitchen window, making me jump half out of my skin, sloshing coffee over my white-knuckled hands. Heart-pounding, I twisted to look, but there was nothing there. Just the scraggly dogwood Cal's mama had planted years ago, its leaves gone russet with the season. "Get a hold of yourself, Bree," I muttered, getting up to dump my mug in the sink with shaking hands. I couldn't let myself go spinning off into flights of fancy, seeing boogeymen in every shadow. Whatever I'd encountered in the burial ground, it had let me go, hadn't it? Maybe it had just been trying to scare me off, protect its territory from foolhardy humans. And yet, as much as I tried to rationalize it away, a small, secret part of me knew the truth. I had stood face to face with something old and evil and utterly inhuman, something that had marked me in some indefinable way. Even now, safe within the walls of Cal's house, I could feel its presence lurking at the edges of my consciousness, patient and ruthless as a spider in its web. The crunch of tires on gravel shook me out of my dark thoughts. I pasted on a bright smile as the front door banged open, emitting Cal and the two brightest lights of my world in a gust of crisp autumn air. "Mama, Mama, look what we found!" My daughter Liza thrust a hand under my nose, proudly displaying a hickory nut brown as an old saddle. "Why, that's right pretty, baby. You find that all by yourself?" I swept her into a fierce hug, breathing in her little kid smell of crayons and peanut butter, feeling her vital warmth against my chest. "Nuh-uh." Jake helped. Liza squirmed free to point at her brother, who was busy shedding his windbreaker in the middle of the living room floor. "Only 'cause you're too short to reach the good branches," Jake said, flashing me a gap-toothed grin. At 8, he considered himself quite the little man, always looking out for his sister. Well, I'm sure proud of you both. What do you say we take those treasures out on the porch and see if we can find some more for dinner? "Yeah!" they chorused, already racing each other to the door. I followed more slowly, Cal falling into step beside me. "Feeling better?" he asked, his eyes searching my face. I summoned up a smile, hoping it reached my eyes. Right as rain now that I've got my babies home. It wasn't the whole truth, but it would have to do. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of fragrant chili on the stove, the happy chatter of my children, and the solid, steadying presence of my husband at my side. By the time I tucked the kids into the bed they shared, the horrors of the afternoon seemed distant, like a scary story that had lost its power in the light of day. But that night, as I lay curled in Cal's arms in the bed that had once been his grandfather's, I dreamed. I dreamed of a forest where the trees had eyes, where the very earth thirsted for blood. I dreamed of a figure in rags the color of old moss, a figure with too many mouths and long grasping fingers. It called to me in a voice like dead leaves, urging me to come back just a little closer. I woke with a scream lodged in my throat, my nightgown plastered to my skin with icy sweat. Cal slept on beside me, snoring softly, but I knew I wouldn't be so lucky. Resigned, I slipped out of bed, wrapping my grandmother's quilt around my shoulders like a shield. I padded barefoot through the house, the old floorboards creaking out a familiar lullaby. In the kitchen, I put on a pot of coffee, knowing I'd need the fortification for the long night ahead. While it brewed, I stood at the window, staring out into the darkness where I knew the woods lay in wait. Maybe it was just a trick of the moonlight, but for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the tree line. A figure in tattered rags, its face a writhing mass of shadow. It raised one stick-thin arm, beckoning. I blinked and it was gone. Just a shadow, a figment of my exhausted imagination. But as I turned away from the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the thing in the woods was far from done with me, and God help me, but some small, secret part of me yearned to answer its call, to plunge headlong into the primal mystery of those ancient trees and the spirits that lurked within. The rational part of my mind recoiled at the thought, but deep in my bones, I felt the pull of something older than reason, older than fear. I poured my coffee with an unsteady hand, wrapping my fingers around the warm ceramic like a talisman. Come what may, I had to be strong for Cal and for my babies. I couldn't let the darkness in, no matter how sweetly it called my name. But as I sat there in the yellow pool of the kitchen light, watching the night press against the windows like a living thing, I knew the truth. The darkness was already inside me, planted like a seed by the touch of a nightmare made flesh. All I could do was hope I was strong enough to keep it at bay. For all our sakes. I'll never forget the summer of 2019. It was the year I decided to take my cousin Jake up on his long-standing invitation to visit him in Crestone, Colorado. Jake had been raving about this small town, nestled at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains for years, always going on about the stunning scenery, the quirky local culture, and the endless outdoor activities. As a committed city dweller, I had always politely declined, preferring the comforts and excitement of urban life. But after a particularly grueling year at work, I found myself craving a change of pace, a chance to unplug and recharge in a different setting. So I called up Jake, booked a flight to Denver, and set off on what I thought would be a relaxing week in the wilderness. Little did I know, relaxation would be the last thing on the agenda. Jake picked me up at the Denver airport in his beat-up old Jeep Wrangler. As we set off on the 4-hour drive to Crestone, he regaled me with stories about the town's eclectic mix of hippies, spiritual seekers, and nature enthusiasts. He described the incredible hiking trails that crisscross the mountains, the hot springs where you could soak away your cares, and the amazing stargazing opportunities afforded by the lack of light pollution. Despite my initial reservations, I found myself getting caught up in his enthusiasm. By the time we pulled up to his cozy cabin on the outskirts of town, I was actually looking forward to a week of outdoor adventures. That first evening, we kept things low-key. We grabbed a couple of beers from Jake's fridge and settled onto his back deck, watching as the setting sun painted the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo range in shades of orange and pink. As the light faded and the first stars began to wink into view, Jake pointed out constellations I had never been able to see in the city. Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia. They all blazed overhead with a clarity that took my breath away. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Maybe this trip was exactly what I needed. The next morning, Jake was eager to show me around his favorite spots in the area. After a hearty breakfast of eggs and homemade sourdough toast, we packed up his Jeep with hiking gear, snacks, and plenty of water. Our destination for the day was the Great Sand Dunes National Park, a surreal landscape where towering sand dunes butted up against the base of the mountains. As we drove the winding road into the park, I couldn't help but marvel at the stark beauty of the terrain. It was like someone had dropped a piece of the Sahara Desert into the middle of the Rockies. We spent the morning hiking among the dunes, our calves burning as we slogged up the steep slopes of sand. The higher we climbed, the more incredible the views became. From the top of the tallest dune, we could see for miles in every direction, an endless expanse of sand and sky, bordered by the rugged peaks of the Sangre de Cristos. We whooped and hollered as we ran back down the dunes, our feet sinking into the soft sand with each bounding step. By early afternoon, we were both exhausted and exhilarated, ready for a change of scenery. Jake suggested we head to a secluded camping spot he knew in the nearby national forest. It was a place he often went to get away from it all, he said, a hidden gem that not many people knew about. I was game for anything at that point, still riding high on the rush of the day's adventures. We stopped back at his cabin to grab our camping gear, then set off down a series of increasingly rough dirt roads deep into the woods. After about 30 minutes of bouncing along, Jake pulled off into a small clearing and killed the engine. We shouldered our packs and set off on foot, following a narrow trail that snaked through the dense undergrowth. The forest was cool and quiet, the only sounds the crunching of our boots on the path and the occasional trill of a bird in the canopy above. After about half a mile, we emerged into another clearing, this one bordered by a babbling stream. It was an idyllic spot, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time. We set about making camp, pitching our tent, and gathering firewood as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. As darkness fell, we huddled around the crackling campfire, trading stories and sipping from a flask of whiskey Jake had brought along. The stars overhead were even more incredible out here, away from any hint of civilization. We talked and laughed late into the night, enjoying each other's company and the peaceful solitude of the forest. Eventually, the chill of the mountain air and the exertions of the day caught up with us. We banked the fire and crawled into our sleeping bags, zipping the tent closed against the night. I remember lying there for a few minutes, marveling at the absolute stillness and quiet. No traffic noise, no sirens, no drunken revelers stumbling home from the bars. Just the gentle rustling of the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I drifted off to sleep feeling more content than I had in years. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but it was still pitch black outside. At first, I couldn't figure out what had roused me. I lay there in my sleeping bag, blinking up at the darkness, trying to get my bearings. Then I heard it, a strange scratching noise coming from just outside the tent. My first thought was that it must be some small animal, a raccoon or a squirrel maybe, attracted by the scent of our leftover food. But as I listened more closely, I realized the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful to be a foraging critter. Beside me, Jake stirred in his sleeping bag. "You hear that?" I whispered, not wanting to raise my voice. He grunted, still half asleep, but then sat up abruptly as the scratching sound came again, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What the hell is that?" He hissed, fumbling for his flashlight. I grabbed his arm, stopping him before he could switch on the light. "Don't," I breathed, not sure why I was so certain that drawing attention to ourselves was a bad idea. "Just wait." We sat there in tense silence, hardly daring to breathe as the thing outside continued to move around the perimeter of the tent. The growling grew louder, interspersed with a snuffling sound that reminded me of a dog catching a scent. But whatever this was, it was way bigger than any dog I had ever encountered. I could hear the heavy thud of its footsteps, the snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves as it circled us. Suddenly, something slammed into the side of the tent, right near my head. I barely managed to stifle a yelp of terror, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to escape. Jake's hand found mine in the darkness and squeezed, his palms slick with sweat. The thing was right outside now, so close I could hear the rasp of its breath, smell the rank, musky odor of its fur. Then it made a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a roar, but not like any roar I had ever heard before. It started low, a deep bass rumble that I felt in my bones, then rose in pitch to an ear-splitting shriek that made my teeth ache. It was a sound of pure primal rage, a challenge and a warning rolled into one. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear deeper and more visceral than anything I had ever experienced. In that moment I was certain I was going to die, torn to shreds by some unknown monster in the darkness. Time seemed to stretch and warp, seconds feeling like hours as the creature paced outside, snarling and growling like something out of a nightmare. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it was gone. The forest fell silent again, save for the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Jake and I sat there for a long moment, clutching each other's hands, hardly daring to believe it was over. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here now." I didn't argue. We burst out of the tent, pausing just long enough to grab our essentials before tearing off through the woods back toward the jeep. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots caught at our feet, but we hardly noticed, driven by pure adrenaline and the primal need to get as far away as possible. When we finally burst out of the tree line into the clearing where we had parked, I nearly wept with relief. Jake fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to unlock the doors. We threw our packs in the back and peeled out in a spray of gravel, the jeep's headlights cutting through the darkness like twin knives. We didn't talk much on the drive back to Jake's cabin, both of us too shaken by what had just happened. It was only when we were inside, the door locked and bolted behind us, that we allowed ourselves to breathe. Jake grabbed a couple beers from the fridge with trembling hands, popped the tops and handed one to me. We collapsed onto the couch, taking long, shuddering pulls from the bottles. What the hell was that thing?" Jake asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head at a loss. "I don't know. A bear, maybe? But the sound it made—" "That was no bear," Jake said firmly. "I've never heard anything like that in my life. And the way it moved, the intelligence behind it. That was no animal. A chill ran down my spine at his words. He was right. Whatever had stalked us in those woods, it was far beyond anything in the natural world. The thought made me feel small, insignificant, like an ant who had unwittingly wandered into the path of a boot. We sat up for hours that night, drinking and talking in circles, trying to make sense of the unexplainable. By the time the sun began to peek over the mountains, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gold, we were no closer to an answer. But one thing was certain, neither of us would ever be the same. The next day, despite our exhaustion and lingering fear, we knew we had to go back to the campsite. We had left most of our gear behind in our frantic escape, and as much as the thought of returning made my skin crawl, I knew I couldn't leave Colorado without my wallet and phone. The hike back felt different in the daylight, less ominous somehow. But when we reached the clearing where we had camped, any sense of relief evaporated. The place was a wreck. Our tent had been shredded, the nylon hanging in tatters from the bent poles. Our packs had been torn open, the contents strewn about like confetti after a parade. And everywhere in the mud along the banks of the stream were footprints. But they weren't human or even animal. They were elongated, almost oblong, with splayed toes that looked more like fingers. And they were huge, half again as long as my own size 11 boots. Jake let out a low whistle, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "Holy shit," he breathed. "Can you believe this? We have to tell someone, call the park service or something." But I was already shaking my head. And tell them what? That we were attacked by Bigfoot? They'll think we're nuts or drunk or both. We'll be lucky if they don't slap us with a fine for camping in an undesignated area. Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment his shoulders slumped. "Yeah, you're probably right. But man, can you imagine if we had proof? A clear footprint or a hair sample or God, a photo? We'd be famous. The guys who finally proved Sasquatch is real." I suppressed a shudder at the thought. Fame is the last thing I want from this. I just want to forget it ever happened, go back to my normal life and never think about monsters in the woods again. We gathered what was left of our gear in silence, stuffing it into trash bags from Jake's Jeep. The drive back to Denver was subdued, both of us lost in our own dark thoughts. When Jake dropped me off at the airport, we hugged awkwardly, not sure what to say. "Let's just keep this between us, okay?" I said finally, my voice rough. "I don't want to be the crazy cousin at Thanksgiving dinner." Jake managed to laugh at that, though it sounded forced. "Yeah, no worries. What happens in Crestone stays in Crestone." I boarded my flight feeling drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The events of the past 2 days kept replaying in my mind. The terror of that night in the woods, the gut-wrenching wrongness of those footprints. A part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a bad dream, a product of too much whiskey and an overactive imagination. But I knew, deep in my bones, that what we had experienced was real. The world was stranger and more frightening than I had ever dared to imagine, and I had looked into the abyss and seen it looking back. In the months that followed, Jake and I talked on the phone a few times, always skirting around the topic that loomed between us like a specter. He would make vague references to that camping trip or the incident, but we never spoke of it directly. It was like we had made an unspoken pact to bury it, to pretend it had never happened. But late at night, lying in bed in my city apartment, with the sounds of traffic and sirens drifting up from the streets below, I would sometimes allow myself to remember the stillness of the forest, the icy grip of fear, the bone-shaking roar that echoed from the darkness, and I would wonder, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of my room, what else might be out there in the wild places of the world, lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. This was years ago now, but I remember it, all of it. I loved the forest and I loved hunting, but not so much anymore. That night the moon was full, but the trees choked its light. Streams of silver fought for every inch, peeking through the canopy. Footfalls in the forest echoed, and the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs announced my presence. I wasn't lost, but I had not found what I was looking for. Earlier that day I had shot a deer and felt wrong. That's the best way to explain it. Just wrong. I had had no luck sitting in my stand for hours, but then it walked out of the tree line. A huge buck. It strolled right to the center of the clearing, head pivoting side to side and then up. It looked straight at me. I took aim, lining up my crosshairs on the deer, and suddenly a voice in the back of my head whispered. I thought, just don't take the shot. The voice insisted. I lined up my crosshairs again. The deer didn't blink. Its glassy black eyes stared up at me. I think it knows I'm here. Why isn't it running? My chest started to tighten. I don't know. But don't do it. The voice continued. I curled my finger around the trigger and began to squeeze. The voice was screaming now, warning me not to do it. I knew I shouldn't have pulled that trigger, but I did. God, what I'm saying doesn't even make sense. But it's what I saw, it's what I did. I shot the deer and it didn't budge. It took that bullet between the shoulder blades, like some sort of mosquito bite. It flicked its ear, licked its nose, turned its head, and walked back to the gap between the trees, vanishing. I climbed down the tree stand, approaching the spot where the deer had been hit. There was blood, but it wasn't right. The wound I had made in the deer's chest was mere moments ago, and yet the blood on the ground was already clotted and dried. I followed the blood trail into the trees. The smell, oh God, it was horrible, like the stench of swamp mud and rot. Something was off, but I had to track it down. My dad had instilled in me strong hunting ethics. Know your gun, shoot only when certain, and always track down wounded game. I can't explain why I felt the way I did. Watching it walk back into the woods made my stomach drop. But why, my inner voice returned. It wasn't a deer, and it saw you. It took that bullet like a slap on the back. Then what was it? I don't know. But it wasn't a deer. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of summer. The chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, frogs joining the chorus on cue. Everything was in motion. I followed the blood trail, refusing to give up for the night. I had to find it. Suddenly the trail stopped at the base of a large tree. The blood had been heavy and constant up to that point. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Where could it have gone? Then something thick and sticky struck my forehead. I reached up, touched it, and brought my fingers into the light. Red. Blood. I shone my light up into the tree, and there it was. Halfway up the trunk, more blood. Further up, on one of the branches, more blood. That's not right. I tried to rationalize. Had the deer succumbed to its injuries? Had it been dragged up the tree by something else? No, there wasn't enough blood for that, and there were no remains. How did blood get up in the tree? It must be from another wounded animal, not the one I'm tracking. Perhaps I got swapped onto its trail instead. But that can't be right. I knew I was tracking the same trail the entire time. The only explanation is that the deer, that thing I shot, scaled this tree. Deer don't climb. So where is it now? I shone my light into the treetops, but there was nothing. The branches were bare, no sign of life anywhere. Crap, now what? I decided to make camp since the trail was dead. There was nothing left to track. I set up my tent and gathered some wood for a fire beneath the tree. I tried to get some rest, but sleep would not come. I kept replaying the events from earlier over and over again. The more I thought about it, the less anything made sense. And the less sense things made, the more threatened I felt. I set up, stoking the fire, and grabbed my weapon. I was ready to fight. Not ready to win, perhaps, but to fight. What are you doing? A voice in my head asked. I just want to be ready. I replied to myself. Ready for what? I'm not sure, but it makes me feel better. No, you know what? You shouldn't have shot that deer. Sitting by my fire, I remained at the ready, constantly scanning the area, listening to every sound the forest threw at me. The night was loud. The forest was alive with creatures all caught in a perpetual state of hunting or hiding. Then faintly, I heard a snapping sound. I turned and raised my gun toward the void. The orange glow of the fire danced on the barrel, illuminating the campsite, but revealing nothing beyond it. I decided not to use my flashlight. I wanted complete control of the weapon. Motionless, I sat there listening very closely. Nothing, just the crackling of the fire. Yeah, that's all it was. Just a crack of the fire, I told myself. Nothing out there? I knew that wasn't true, but it was the only thing I could say to convince myself to lower the gun. The night dragged on, but I survived despite the occasional kamikaze moth pelting me. As dawn broke, the cold morning air, tinged with a light blue hue, enveloped the forest. It was a welcome change from the heat that lay ahead. A thick fog had rolled in. I extinguished the remnants of my fire, packed up my gear, and prepared to head to the pickup location. My friend wouldn't be able to get me for another day, but at least I'd be ready. I squatted down to retrieve my packed bag, slinging it over my shoulders in one swift motion. The swirling fog parted where the bag had lain, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. Tracks. Not just any tracks. Deer tracks. Hundreds of them. The hoofprint struck deep into the damp ground around the campsite, forming a perfect circle around my camp. This thing had been circling me all night long, just beyond the firelight. But that couldn't be. I would have heard something. There were hundreds of tracks. It would have had to make noise at some point. As I looked closer, it became apparent there were no tracks showing entry or exit from the area. It was like the deer had simply materialized right beside the campsite and vanished when it was done. "Forget this. I'm out of here," I muttered to myself, as I began the long trek to the pickup location. However, I decided not to stop there. I would hike down the logging road to the mouth of the main dirt road that my buddy would have to drive down to get to the meetup spot. Honestly, it didn't do much in getting me out of here any sooner, but it was good to have a mission to work towards. Any amount of time shaved off in these woods was better. Most of the hike was uneventful. I was approaching well over halfway to the meeting spot when I decided it was time for a break. I rummaged around in my bag for water and a protein bar. I was making great time. At this rate, a few more hours of hiking, and I would be on the logging road in no time. And only a half-hour hike from the main dirt road. A branch popped behind me. I lifted my gun and swung around to the noise in one fluid motion, scanning the area. The forest is thick this time of year, so my view of my surroundings was limited. This thing could be mere feet away, and I wouldn't see it. The iron sights of my rifle glided across the forest, and then stopped. I saw something. A big patch of brush, but something was off with it. At the top of a large bush, there were weird branches coming out, oddly bare. No, they weren't branches, I realized. They were antlers. My hands tightened around my weapon as I pulled its buttstock tight against my shoulder. Tunnel vision kicked in. I saw nothing aside from that bush. Then I guessed where the head would be relative to the exposed antlers. I took aim, and I squeezed the trigger. The kick of the gun jolted my insides. A loud, thunderous bang ripped through the forest, followed by the burnt smell of gunpowder. It didn't even flinch. No movement at all from this thing. The tips of its antlers were still visible. Then the exposed point slowly lowered down, out of sight into the brush. Everything was still. Everything was quiet. Everything was wrong. I grabbed my bag and began to run, as fast as the forest would let me, towards the direction of the logging road. Tearing through the woods, between the snapping and whipping of vines and branches, I could swear I heard something tailing me, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. So I kept running. I burst through the thicket and into open air, the resistance of the forest vanishing, toppling me forward onto the dusty red earth. An orange cloud surrounded me as I slid across the dirt road. I rolled over. Facing right, exited the tree line, chest heaving, waiting for that thing to rip through the foliage and jump right on top of me. But as I sat on the road, gun up, nothing came from the woods. The forest was still. I think I'm losing my mind. I lifted myself up from the dirt, brushed off my clothes, and gathered my bearings. It's this way. I started down the dirt path, hiking for a few minutes, before a section of cleared forest came into view on the right side of the path. It was an old logging site, stumps jutting out like headstones in a tree graveyard. The clearing was littered with the tracks of trucks and the branches of past harvests. It was a wide open expanse of mangled wood and debris. This is as far as I go for now, I thought. The sun will be going down in a few hours, and there's no point in going further. Plus, this will make a great spot for camp. The best parts were an abundance of firewood, an open view of my surroundings, and the ground being completely littered with branches, so I could hear anyone or anything coming. No trees mean no cover for it from my shots. Yeah, this is as good as it gets. One last night, and my buddy will be here first thing in the morning to get me. Just one more night. For the last time I set up camp, stacking a quick pile of firewood and standing guard as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night crept in from the forest around me. I could sense I wasn't alone. The feeling had been lingering before dusk, but now it was closer, more persistent. The hours passed slowly. The wind was relentless, constantly threatening to snuff out my flames. I kept shifting my position to shield the fire with my body, but it was barely enough to keep it lit. The darkness was thicker than the night before, with no moon or stars, only clouds blanketing the sky and its light. It was quieter tonight. There were no sounds of bugs or animals, just the rustling trees and howling wind. Time dragged on, with nothing happening. Dawn was only a couple of hours away. I made it, I thought. Maybe I am losing my mind. Then I saw it. A silhouette approaching my camp. The fire cast a faint glow, but I couldn't make out any details. It looked like my friend, my buddy. Maybe he's ahead of schedule, I thought. And he was drawn by the light of my fire. I stood up to greet him, but froze mid-stride. As the figure moved closer, the darkness around it melted away. It wasn't my friend. It wasn't even a man. The legs were far too skinny. The arms hung at odd angles, and what looked like long hair rose from its shoulders and writhing lines above its head. As it stepped into the light, I saw it clearly, every horrifying detail. It was that deer, but not a deer at all. This thing continued walking straight towards me. It moved on its hind legs like a man. The forearms, now drooping in front of its body, ended in claws instead of hooves. Its jaw hung loosely on its hinge, revealing rows upon rows of jagged, malformed teeth. Its antlers, now more resembling tentacles, whipped at the surrounding air, and its eyes, no longer on the sides of its head, had shifted somehow to the center of its face, one atop the other. I raised my gun, took aim. Then something from the sky hit my hand, then my cheek. It ran down my face and off my chin. It was beginning to rain. The sky opened up, unleashing a downpour that extinguished my fire in mere seconds, plunging me into darkness. The last sight I had of this thing was it advancing towards me. I fired my gun in the dark. The flash from the discharge revealed nothing of its location, but I saw my flashlight on the ground to my left. I could hear nothing over the ringing in my ears from the shot. Even the beating of the rain was lost on me. Keeping my gun raised, I bent down with one arm outstretched, feeling around the ground for my flashlight until I touched the familiar smoothness of plastic against the rough earth. I grabbed it, and as I did, I felt fur brush against my outstretched arm. I swung the gun in that direction and pulled the trigger. The recoil threw the gun from my hand, and I felt something warm and sticky splatter across my face. Clutching the flashlight, I dug my feet into the ground and pushed off into a sprint. I clicked on the light and picked a direction, the rain beating against my face, washing sweat into my eyes, making them sting. Each falling droplet obscured more of the light, leaving me barely enough visibility to keep my footing. I ran and ran until I hit even ground, the light illuminating the muddy path of the dirt road. I continued down the path until I lost my footing, sliding in the mud. The flashlight bounced ahead of me, landing with its beam pointed back in the direction I'd come from. I rolled over onto my back and saw a tall, shadowy figure running up the path towards me. Scrambling to my feet, I left the light where it lay and let my instincts guide me. I didn't stop running until my footsteps slapped against pavement. I'd made it all the way to the main highway. The sun was beginning to rise over the trees. I walked along the side of the road until I heard a familiar voice call out behind me, "Hey!" I stopped and turned to see my buddy, half hanging out the window of his truck, a look of concern and confusion on his face. "What the heck happened to you?" he asked, hopping out of the driver's side door. I paused and just stared at him, unsure of how to explain. How could anyone understand? I finally said the only thing that made any sense. "I shot a deer." Bill, brine, the gentle hum of cicadas filled the warm summer air as I gazed out over the vast expanse of our family's cattle farm. It was 1995, and at 10 years old I thought I knew every inch of this land. The rustling cornfields, the rickety old barn with its faded red paint, the murky pond where bullfrogs croaked their nightly chorus. It was all as familiar to me as my own reflection. Our farmhouse stood alone, a weathered sentinel watching over 500 acres of Oklahoma soil. The nearest neighbors were the Johnsons, their mailbox a tiny speck on the horizon some 5 miles down the dusty road. Tulsa, the closest city, might as well have been on another planet. James, my mother's voice carried from the back porch. Dinner time! I reluctantly tore myself away from my perch on the fence post, giving one last look at the setting sun, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As beautiful as it was, there was always a hint of melancholy that came with nightfall on the farm. The vastness that felt like freedom during the day became something else entirely when darkness fell. Inside, the familiar sense of pot roast and fresh-baked rolls filled the air. My older sister, Abigail, was already seated at the table, her nose buried in a book as usual. Dad came in from the barn, his weathered hands leaving faint smudges of grease on the doorframe as he entered. "How are those new calves doing, John?" Mom asked, as she set down a steaming bowl of mashed potatoes. Dad grunted as he washed up at the sink. "Coming along. That runt might not make it, though. Shame." I pushed my peas around my plate, only half listening to their conversation. My mind was still outside, wondering what mysteries the night might hold. August 15th, 1995. My 11th birthday. The day started like any other, up before dawn to help Dad with the morning chores. But there was an undercurrent of excitement thrumming through me. Birthdays were a big deal in our family, one of the few times we really celebrated. After a breakfast of chocolate chip pancakes, a once-a-year treat, Mom and Dad presented me with a long, narrow box wrapped in shiny blue paper. "Go on, open it," Abigail urged, a rare show of enthusiasm from my typically aloof teenage sister. I tore into the wrapping, revealing a sleek black case. My heart raced as I popped the latches and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in molded foam, was a telescope. Not a toy, but a real, honest-to-goodness astronomical telescope. "It's a Celestron First Scope," Dad explained, a hint of pride in his voice. 114mm reflector. "Should give you a nice view of the moon, planets, even some deep sky objects." I was speechless. For months, I'd been devouring every book on astronomy I could get my hands on during our bi-weekly trips to the library in town. The vastness of space fascinated me, and now I had a tool to explore it myself. That night, after dinner and a generous slice of Mom's homemade chocolate cake, I lugged the telescope out to the field behind our house. The sky was perfectly clear, a canvas of inky black studded with diamonds. I carefully aligned the finder scope just like I'd read about and pointed it towards the waxing gibbous moon. When I pressed my eye to the eyepiece, I gasped. The cratered surface of the moon filled my vision in stunning detail. I could make out individual mountains and valleys along the Terminator line, where sunlight and shadow met. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. For hours, I explored the night sky, Jupiter's bands and moons, the rings of Saturn, the Andromeda Galaxy, a smudge of light representing billions of stars. I was so engrossed that I barely noticed the chills settling into my bones as the night wore on. It wasn't until I heard the distant lowing of cattle that I finally tore myself away from the eyepiece. I blinked, disoriented, realizing how late it must be. As my eyes readjusted to the darkness, I noticed something odd on the horizon. A pinprick of light, too bright and too low to be a star, hovered just above the tree line. At first, I thought it might be the headlights of a car on some distant road. But then it moved. Not the steady progression of a vehicle, but a quick, darting motion that defied explanation. It zipped to the left, stopped on a dime, then shot straight up before disappearing entirely. I rubbed my eyes, certain I must be seeing things. When I looked again, the strange light was gone. Only the familiar constellations remained, wheeling slowly overhead. A cool breeze rustled through the cornfield behind me, raising goosebumps on my arms. Suddenly, the vast openness of the farm felt oppressive rather than freeing. I hurriedly packed up the telescope and practically ran back to the house, all the while feeling as though unseen eyes were watching my retreat. As I climbed into bed that night, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. It must have been a trick of the light, or maybe my eyes playing tricks after staring through the telescope for so long. But a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. What if it had been something else? Something that didn't belong in the skies above our quiet Oklahoma farm? I drifted off to an uneasy sleep, my dreams filled with dancing lights and shadowy figures that always remained just out of sight. The incident with the strange light faded from my mind over the next few weeks as summer gave way to fall. School started up again, and between homework and increased responsibilities on the farm, I had little time for stargazing. But the seed of unease had been planted, and it was about to take root in ways I could never have imagined. It was a crisp Saturday morning in early October when Dad asked me to check the fence line near the pond. We'd had some issues with coyotes lately, and he wanted to make sure there were no weak spots they could exploit. I set out just after breakfast, the dew-laden grass soaking my jeans as I made my way across the pasture. The pond lay about a half-mile from the house, nestled in a small copse of oak and hickory trees. As I approached, I could hear the familiar chorus of bullfrogs and crickets. The fence seemed intact as I began my inspection, no signs of digging or damage. I was about halfway around the pond when something caught my eye. There, in the soft mud at the water's edge, was a set of tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I crouched down for a closer look, my heart beginning to race. The prints were large, easily twice the size of my own foot. But it wasn't just the size that was strange. They were three-toed, with what looked like sharp claw marks at the end of each digit. The stride between each print was massive, suggesting whatever made them was tall and long-legged. My first thought was some kind of bird. We occasionally saw great blue herons around the pond, but I'd seen heron tracks before, and these were different. The shape was all wrong, and they were far too deep. Whatever left these prints was heavy. As I studied the tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a twig snapped in the woods behind me. I whirled around, suddenly very aware of how alone I was out here. The trees stood silent and still, no sign of movement. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I hurriedly snapped a few photos with the disposable camera I'd brought along to document any fence damage. Then, trying to keep my pace steady, despite the urge to run, I made my way back to the house. Dad was in the barn when I returned, tinkering with the tractor. I hesitated before approaching him, unsure of how to explain what I'd seen. "Hey, kiddo," he greeted me without looking up from his work. "How's the fence looking?" "Fine," I said, my voice sounding strangely high-pitched to my own ears. "But, Dad, I found something weird by the pond." He grunted, still focused on the tractor's engine. "What's that?" I took a deep breath. There were these tracks, big ones, like nothing I've ever seen before. Just that got his attention. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Show me." We walked back to the pond together, my stomach churning with a mix of excitement and dread. But when we reached the spot where I'd seen the prints, my heart sank. The mud had dried in the late morning sun, obscuring the details of the tracks. They were still visible, but nowhere near as clear as they had been earlier. Dad crouched down, examining the faint impressions. "Huh," he muttered. "Probably just a heron or something. Maybe a big snapping turtle crawled out here." I shook my head vehemently. "No, Dad, you don't understand. They were huge and three-toed with claws. I've never seen anything like it." He stood up, placing a calloused hand on my shoulder. "James, I know you've got a good imagination, but you can't let it run wild out here. There's nothing on this farm that could make tracks like what you're describing." But I started to protest. "No buts," he cut me off firmly. "Now come on, we've got work to do." As we walked back to the barn, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. I knew what I'd seen, but without clear evidence, how could I make him believe me? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of those strange tracks from my mind. Nor could I forget the feeling that something had been watching me from the woods. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally did, my dreams were filled with lumbering shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision, always retreating when I turned to look. As autumn deepened, a new strangeness crept into our nightly routine. It started subtly at first, just on the edge of perception, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The first time I noticed it, I was up late reading one of my astronomy books by flashlight. It was well past midnight, and the house was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. Then almost imperceptibly the humming began. It wasn't loud, not really. More like a vibration you could feel in your chest. A sound so low it was more physical sensation than audible noise. I put down my book, straining my ears to locate the source. Was it coming from outside? The basement? I couldn't tell. After a few minutes it faded away as mysteriously as it had begun. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably just some farm equipment running in the distance. But over the next few weeks, the humming became a regular occurrence. Always at night, always when the house was quiet. Sometimes it would last for just a few minutes, other times for hours. I mentioned it to Abigail one morning over breakfast. "You hear it too?" she asked, her eyes widening slightly. I thought I was going crazy. "What do you think it is?" I whispered, not wanting our parents to overhear. She shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Probably just some new equipment Dad's running. Or maybe it's coming from the Johnsons' place," but we both knew that wasn't right. The Johnsons' farm was too far away, and Dad hadn't bought any new machinery recently. One night, about 3 weeks after the humming first started, I decided to investigate. I waited until well after midnight, when I was sure everyone else was asleep. Then, moving as quietly as I could, I crept downstairs and out the back door. The night was cool and clear, a nearly full moon bathing the farm in silvery light. The humming was stronger out here, a steady thrumming that seemed to come from the very air itself. I stood on the porch for a long moment, gathering my courage, before stepping out into the yard. I made my way towards the barn, thinking perhaps the sound was coming from inside. But as I drew closer, I realized the humming wasn't getting any louder. If anything, it seemed to be coming from behind me now, back towards the house. I turned, confused, and that's when I saw it. A faint pulsing glow emanating from the cornfield. It matched the rhythm of the humming perfectly, growing brighter and dimmer in sync with the sound. My heart pounding, I took a few hesitant steps towards the field. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to run back to the house, to wake up Dad and tell him what was happening. But curiosity overrode my fear, pulling me forward like an invisible tether. I reached the edge of the cornfield, the tall stalks looming over me. The glow was definitely coming from within, maybe 100 yards in. Taking a deep breath, I pushed aside the first row of corn and stepped inside. The plants closed in around me immediately, cutting off my view of the farmhouse. I could still see the glow ahead, pulsing steadily. The humming was all-encompassing now, vibrating through my entire body. I pressed forward, my movements clumsy in the tight rows. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that strange, glowing maze. But suddenly, I broke through into a small clearing. And there, hovering about 10 feet off the ground, was the source of the light and sound. It was, I don't even know how to describe it. A sphere of energy, maybe 6 feet in diameter, crackling with what looked like blue electricity. It pulsed in perfect rhythm with the humming, which had grown so loud I could feel it in my teeth. I stood there frozen in awe and terror for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the sphere blinked out of existence. The humming cut off abruptly, leaving my ears ringing in the sudden silence. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away. I ran blindly through the corn, branches whipping at my face and arms. When I finally broke free of the field, I didn't stop running until I was back inside the house, my lungs burning and sweat pouring down my face. I slammed and locked the door behind me, then sank to the floor, trembling. What had I just seen? My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Ball lightning? Some kind of atmospheric phenomenon? But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in our world. As I climbed the stairs back to my room on shaky legs, I glanced out the window toward the cornfield. For just a second, I thought I saw a flicker of blue light between the stalks. But then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. I didn't sleep at all that night, or for several nights after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pulsing sphere. And in the quiet darkness of my room, I could swear I still felt the faintest vibration, a ghost of that otherworldly hum. As October gave way to November, a chill settled over the farm that seemed to seep into my very bones. The strange occurrences continued, becoming more frequent and more terrifying with each passing day. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on a cold, grey afternoon in early November. I was out checking the fence line again, a task that had become fraught with anxiety since my discovery of those strange tracks by the pond. The skeleton fingers of bare trees clawed at a leaden sky, and a bitter wind whipped across the open fields, carrying with it the promise of the first snow. As I approached the edge of the woods that bordered our property, an eerie stillness fell over the land. The constant background noise of the farm, distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through dry corn stalks, vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, easily dismissed as a branch swaying in the wind. But when I turned to look directly at the tree line, my heart nearly stopped. There, partially obscured by a gnarled oak, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet in height. Its body was unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its frame. But it was the skin that made my blood run cold, a mottled grayish-green texture that reminded me of a reptile's scales. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The creature remained motionless as well, and for a moment I prayed that it was just an oddly shaped tree, a trick of the fading light. Then its head turned, and I found myself staring into eyes that were impossibly large and black as the void between stars. There was an intelligence in those eyes, an alien awareness that sent shudders of primal terror through my body. For what felt like an eternity, we regarded each other across the expanse of dead grass. Then, in a movement so swift I almost missed it, the creature stepped back and seemed to melt into the shadows of the forest. The sounds of the farm came rushing back, startling in their sudden return. I gasped, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Without consciously deciding to do so, I found myself running, sprinting back towards the house as fast as my legs could carry me. I burst through the back door, slamming it behind me and sliding the deadbolt home with trembling hands. Mom looked up from where she was preparing dinner, alarm evident on her face. "James, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell her what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe something so utterly alien, so completely outside the realm of normal experience? And even if I could find the words, would she believe me? I thought I saw a coyote, I lied, hating myself for it even as the words left my mouth. Near the woods. It startled me. Mom's face softened with relief. "Oh, honey, I know they can be scary, but they're more afraid of you than you are of them. Did you tell your father? He'll want to know if they're getting bold enough to come close to the house." I shook my head mutely, still trying to process what I'd seen. Mum went back to her cooking, the incident already forgotten in her mind. But I couldn't shake the image of those black, unfathomable eyes staring into mine. That night, I lay awake for hours, jumping at every creak of the old farmhouse settling. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with tall, shadowy figures stalking the edges of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to get a clear look at them. I woke the next morning feeling exhausted and on edge. As I stumbled downstairs for breakfast, I overheard Dad talking to Mom in low, worried tones. Strangest thing, the fence on the north side, it's all torn up, like something big went right through it. And there were these weird marks in the ground, almost like... He trailed off as I entered the kitchen, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, son. Sleep well?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I poured myself a bowl of cereal, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly had my father seen out there. And more importantly, what had he almost said before he noticed me? The weight of unspoken fears hung heavy in the air, and I knew with a dreadful certainty that things on our quiet farm were about to get much, much worse. The weeks following my encounter in the woods passed in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. I jumped at every shadow, convinced that at any moment I would again find myself face to face with the creature I'd seen. But as November dragged on with no further sightings, I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Then, 2 days before Thanksgiving, everything changed. I was helping Dad in the barn, stacking hay bales for winter storage, when we heard Mom calling from the house. There was an edge of panic in her voice that sent chills down my spine. "John! James, come quick!" We rushed back to the house to find Mom standing in the kitchen, the phone clutched tightly in her white-knuckled grip. Her face was pale, eyes wide with shock. "It's the Petersons," she said, her voice trembling. "Their boy, Tommy. He's missing." Tommy Peterson was a year younger than me, the son of a family that owned a farm about 10 miles down the road. We weren't close friends, but I knew him from school and the occasional county fair. "What do you mean, missing?" Dad asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Mom shook her head, clearly struggling to make sense of what she'd been told. "Lisa says he went out to do his chores yesterday evening and never came back. They've been searching all night, but there's no sign of him. The police are involved now. They're asking everyone in the area to keep an eye out." A cold knot of dread formed in the pit of my stomach. I thought back to the strange tracks by the pond, the towering figure in the woods. Could there be a connection? The next few days were a flurry of activity. Dad joined the search parties, combing the countryside, while Mom manned the phones, relaying information and coordinating with other families in the area. I wanted to help, but they insisted I stay close to the house. As the days stretched into a week with no sign of Tommy, wild theories began to circulate. Some blamed coyotes or mountain lions, though no one could remember the last time a big cat had been seen in these parts. Others whispered about drifters or escaped convicts lurking in the area. But late one night, I overheard a conversation that chilled me to my core. I had gotten up for a glass of water and was passing by the living room when I heard Dad's voice, low and urgent. "Not the first time something like this has happened around here," he was saying. "Remember back in '78? The Wilkins girl?" "John, don't!" Mom's voice was strained. "That was different. They never proved..." "Maybe not," Dad cut her off. "But you can't tell me it's not similar. A child vanishing without a trace, right around the same time of year. And now with what James saw in the woods..." My breath caught in my throat. Had Dad believed me after all? "We agreed not to talk about that," Mom hissed. "You'll only scare him more. Besides, it was probably just his imagination running wild. You know how he is with all those sci-fi books he reads." There was a long pause before Dad spoke again, his voice heavy with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Maybe, but Sarah, if there's even a chance, we need to be prepared to protect our family." I crept back to my room, my mind reeling. What did Dad know that he wasn't telling us? And what had happened to the Wilkins girl all those years ago? As I lay in bed, staring at the shadows on my ceiling, a new and terrifying thought occurred to me. What if Tommy's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident? What if it was just the beginning of something much larger and more sinister? The wind howled outside my window, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard something else mixed in with it, a low, pulsing hum that set my teeth on edge. I pulled the covers up over my head, trying to shut out the sound and the fear that came with it. But deep down, I knew that no blanket could protect me from the horrors that seemed to be closing in around our once peaceful farm. The search for Tommy Peterson continued for weeks, but as winter tightened its grip on the Oklahoma countryside, hope began to fade. Christmas came and went, a subdued affair marked more by worry than celebration. The new year arrived, bringing with it a fresh blanket of snow that seemed to muffle the entire world. It was on a bitterly cold night in early January that the true terror began. I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. Groggy and disoriented, I fumbled for my bedside lamp, but nothing happened when I clicked the switch. The power was out. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I became aware of a faint blue glow seeping in around the edges of my curtains. The hum I'd heard so many times before filled the air, but this time it was louder, more insistent. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peered out. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. There, hovering about 20 feet off the ground in our front yard, was the pulsing sphere of energy I'd seen in the cornfield months ago. But this time it wasn't alone. Surrounding the glowing orb were three tall, thin figures. Even from a distance, I recognized their reptilian skin and impossibly long limbs. They stood perfectly still, their huge black eyes fixed on our house. I wanted to scream, to run and wake my parents, but terror had frozen me in place. As I watched, paralyzed, one of the creatures turned its head and looked directly at my window. Our eyes met, and in that moment I felt a presence pushing against my mind. Alien thoughts, incomprehensible and terrifying, flooded my consciousness. Images flashed before my eyes, vast, impossible structures on distant worlds, creatures that defied description, and glimpses of a plan so vast and ancient it made my head spin. Just when I thought my sanity would shatter under the assault, it stopped. The creature turned away, and the pressure on my mind eased. Then, moving with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics, the three beings stepped into the glowing sphere. There was a flash of blue-white light so bright it left spots dancing in my vision, and when I could see again, both the orb and its occupants were gone. The hum faded away, and the normal sounds of the night rushed back in. An owl hooted in the distance, and somewhere a dog barked. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I had seen them, felt the touch of their alien minds, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this was far from over. As if to confirm my fears, a scream shattered the night, raw, primal, and terrifyingly close. It was coming from my sister's room. I bolted from my room, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to reach Abigail. The hallway was pitch black, but I knew the path by heart. As I neared her door, I could hear muffled sobs interspersed with panicked gasps. "Abigail!" I called out, fumbling for the doorknob. "Are you okay?" The door swung open just as our parents came rushing up the stairs, Dad wielding a flashlight that cut through the darkness like a knife. "What's going on?" Mom demanded, her voice tight with worry. Abigail was huddled in the corner of her room, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, darting around the room as if searching for an unseen threat. "I saw them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They were here, in my room. Those things." Dad swept the flashlight beam around the room, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. "What things, honey?" "There's no one here," but I knew. Even as Mom rushed to comfort Abigail, murmuring soothing words about bad dreams, I knew exactly what my sister had seen. "The creatures from the yard," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "The tall ones with the scaly skin and black eyes. They were outside earlier with some kind of glowing orb." My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite decipher. Was it fear? Resignation? For a moment, I thought Dad might deny it all again, might tell me I was letting my imagination run wild. But instead he let out a long, weary sigh. "I was hoping," he began, then shook his head. I was hoping you kids would never have to know about this. That somehow it would pass us by this time. John, Mom said warningly, but he held up a hand to stop her. No, Sarah. They've seen too much. They deserve to know the truth. And so, as the wind howled outside and shadows danced on the walls, our father told us a story. A story that had begun long before we were born, on this very land. He spoke of strange lights in the sky that his own father had witnessed as a boy. Of cattle found mutilated in the fields, their bodies drained of blood with surgical precision. Of people who went missing over the years, always around the same time of year, always without a trace. We thought it was over, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of long-held secrets. It's been quiet for so long. But now they're back, I finished for him. He nodded grimly. And I fear they won't stop until they get what they came for. What do they want? Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a mixture of fear and determination. We don't know for sure, but whatever it is, we're not going to let them have it without a fight. As if in response to his words, the house suddenly shook with a tremendous force. The windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere downstairs I heard the sound of breaking glass. They're here, I said, a strange calm settling over me. The time for fear was past. Now we had to act. Dad's jaw set in a hard line. Sarah, get the kids to the basement. Use the tunnel if you have to. What tunnel? I asked, but Mom was already ushering us towards the stairs. John, be careful, she called back over her shoulder. He nodded once, then turned and strode purposefully towards our parents' bedroom. I caught a glimpse of him reaching for something in the back of the closet before Mom hurried us out of sight. The next few minutes were a blur of confusion and adrenaline. Mom led us to the basement, then to a hidden door behind some old shelving units. Beyond it lay a narrow earthen tunnel, an escape route I'd never known existed. Your father and I hoped we'd never have to use this, Mom explained as she urged us forward. But we always knew there was a chance. Her words were cut off by a deafening crash from upstairs, followed by an inhuman shriek that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Mom's face went pale. Go, she said, pressing something cold and heavy into my hand. I looked down to see an old revolver, its metal gleaming dully in the beam of Mom's flashlight. Get your sister to the Johnsons' farm. Don't stop for anything. Before I could protest, she was closing the hidden door behind us, sealing Abigail and me into the tunnel. I could hear her muffled voice on the other side, uttering what sounded like a prayer. Mom! Abigail cried out, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her deeper into the tunnel. Whatever was happening up there, we couldn't help. Our only choice was to run and hope our parents could handle whatever had invaded our home. We stumbled through the darkness, the beam of the small flashlight Mum had given us barely illuminating the way ahead. The sounds of chaos from the house faded behind us, replaced by the eerie silence of the underground passage. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we emerged into the cold night air. The Johnsons' farmhouse was visible in the distance, its windows dark and silent. As we ran across the open field, I cast one last look back towards our home. What I saw nearly stopped me in my tracks. A column of blue-white light shot up from where our house stood, piercing the low-hanging clouds. Within it I could see dark shapes moving, twisting in ways that hurt my eyes to look at. And rising above it all was that now familiar hum, so loud it seemed to vibrate in my bones. Don't look back, I shouted to Abigail, urging her forward. Just run! The summer of 2020 started like any other in our quiet corner of Washington state. I was 15 years old then, spending my days exploring the lush forests and rugged coastlines that define the Pacific Northwest. Little did I know that this summer would change everything, leaving scars both physical and mental that I still carry with me today. It was early July when my cousins arrived from Nevada for my aunt's wedding. The ceremony itself was a blur of white dresses, awkward dancing, and too sweet cake. But it was what happened 3 days later that etched itself into my memory with terrifying clarity. The day started innocently enough. My parents suggested we take our out-of-town relatives to one of the local beaches, a secluded stretch of sand and pebbles nestled between towering cliffs. The weather was uncharacteristically perfect for Washington. Warm sunshine, a gentle breeze, and only a few wispy clouds in the sky. We piled into 2 cars, coolers loaded with sandwiches and watermelon, beach gear crammed into every available space. The drive to the coast was filled with laughter and excited chatter, my cousins marveling at the dense green forests that lined the winding road. As we crested the final hill, the Pacific Ocean stretched out before us, a vast expanse of blue-gray water disappearing into the horizon. We found a spot to park and lugged our equipment down to the beach, claiming a patch of sand as our own. The next few hours passed in a haze of summer bliss. We took turns on the paddleboards, wobbling and splashing in the chilly water. My Uncle Mike, an avid fisherman, set up his gear and patiently taught my younger cousins how to cast a line. The adults lounged on beach chairs, catching up on family gossip and reminiscing about summers past. I alternated between joining in the activities and retreating to a quiet spot with my sketchbook, trying to capture the wild beauty of the coastline. The rhythmic sound of the waves and the cries of seagulls created a peaceful backdrop to our day. As the afternoon wore on, we gathered around a picnic blanket to devour juicy slices of watermelon. Sticky juice ran down our chins as we spat seeds at each other, competing to see who could launch them the farthest. It was a moment of pure, carefree joy, the kind that only exists in childhood summers, before the weight of the world settles onto your shoulders. If only I had known then how quickly that innocence would be shattered. The sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. In Washington, summer days stretched long into the evening, with twilight lingering until nearly 9 p.m. As the golden hour approached, we began the process of packing up our beach gear. It was then that my Aunt Kay made a suggestion that would change the course of our lives. "Hey, why don't we show the cousins the old military fort before we head back?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's not far from here, and it's such a cool piece of history." The fort in question was a relic from World War II, built to defend the coastline from potential invasion. It had long since been abandoned by the military, left to slowly decay amidst the encroaching forest. Over the years, it had become a popular spot for locals to explore, despite the occasional rumors of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. My cousins, eager for more adventure, immediately agreed. Even the adults seemed enthused by the idea, perhaps caught up in the nostalgia of their own childhood explorations. I felt a twinge of unease, having visited the fort several times before and always leaving with a sense of disquiet. But I pushed the feeling aside, not wanting to dampen the group's enthusiasm. As we loaded the cars and set off for the fort, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. The carefree mood of the beach began to shift, a subtle tension creeping into the air. Looking back, I wonder if some primal part of our brains sensed the danger that lay ahead, trying to warn us away from the path we were about to take. But we drove on, blissfully unaware of the horrors that awaited us in the gathering darkness. The drive to the abandoned military fort was short, but as we wound our way through the dense forest, it felt like we were entering another world entirely. The trees pressed close to the narrow road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, scraping against the sides of our vehicles. The cheerful chatter that had filled the cars during our beach trip gradually faded, replaced by an anticipatory silence. We pulled into the small, gravel parking lot just as the last rays of sunlight were fading from the sky. The fort loomed before us, a massive concrete structure half buried in the hillside. Its weathered surface was stained with decades of exposure to the harsh coastal elements, and thick vines crept up its walls, nature slowly reclaiming what man had built. as we piled out of the cars. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been growing since we left the beach. The air felt heavier here, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed muted, as if the wildlife itself was holding its breath. My uncle Mike, always the history buff, began explaining the fort's significance to my cousins. "This place was built in the early 1940s, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the still air. It was part of a network of coastal defenses meant to protect against Japanese attacks during World War II. Never saw any real action, though. Been abandoned since the 1950s. We approached the main entrance, a yawning black hole in the concrete face of the fort. The heavy metal door that once sealed it shut had long since been removed, leaving only rusty hinges as evidence of its existence. A cool draft emanated from the darkness within, carrying with it the musty scent of damp stone and decay. My Aunt Kay pulled out a handful of flashlights from her backpack, distributing them among the group. "Stay close together," she warned. "It's easy to get turned around in there." As we stepped into the fort, the temperature dropped noticeably. Our flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing long corridors branching off in different directions. The walls were covered in a patchwork of graffiti, some artistic, some crude, all adding to the sense of abandonment and neglect. We moved deeper into the structure, our footsteps echoing ominously. The fort was laid out in a rough C shape, with a series of rooms lining the outer wall and a long, dark hallway connecting the two ends. Every so often, we'd come across a gun emplacement, massive concrete openings that once housed artillery pieces aimed out to sea. As we explored, I noticed my younger cousins growing increasingly nervous. They huddled closer to the adults, their eyes wide as they took in the imposing surroundings. Even the grown-ups seemed on edge, their jokes and casual conversation feeling forced and hollow in the oppressive atmosphere of the fort. We had been exploring for about 20 minutes when my Aunt Kay made another suggestion. "Hey, why don't we go up top?" she said, gesturing towards a narrow staircase. "The view from up there is incredible." There was a murmur of agreement from the group, and we began to ascend the worn concrete steps. I hung back slightly, my earlier unease returning in full force. Something about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was bothering me. As we emerged onto the roof of the fort, a gust of wind whipped around us, carrying with it the salty tang of the ocean. The view was indeed spectacular. Rolling hills covered in dense forest stretched out before us, giving way to the vast expanse of the Pacific. In the fading light, it was easy to imagine how this vantage point would have been crucial for spotting approaching enemy ships. We spread out across the roof, taking in the scenery and snapping photos. I found myself drifting towards the edge, peering down at the steep drop to the ground below. It was then that I noticed something odd. The usual cacophony of birdsong that filled the forest at dusk was conspicuously absent. The only sound was the whisper of the wind and the distant crash of waves against the shore. Tom was about to mention this to the others when I realized they had already started making their way back down to ground level. In the growing darkness, I could see their flashlight beams bobbing as they descended the stairs and emerged from the fort's entrance. For a moment, I considered following them, but a nagging curiosity held me back. I wanted to complete a circuit of the roof, to see the fort from all angles. It was a decision I would come to regret deeply. As I began my solitary walk around the perimeter of the roof, the last vestiges of daylight faded from the sky. The world around me was plunged into an inky blackness, broken only by the faint glow of starlight and the dim beam of my flashlight. The wind picked up, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. I was about halfway around the roof when I felt it, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread that stopped me in my tracks. My heart began to race, pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I was frozen in place, my eyes scanning the darkness for the source of my fear. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes gleaming in the tree line, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. At first I thought it might be a deer, a common sight in these woods. But as I looked closer, I realized with growing horror that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The eyes were too far forward on the creature's face, more like a predator than a herbivore, and they were fixed on me with an intelligence that no ordinary animal should possess. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the creature's head began to turn, not in the natural way of an animal looking around, but in a full, unnatural rotation that defied the laws of anatomy. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something not of this world, something that meant me harm, and as those impossible eyes continued to bore into me, I realized that my life would never be the same again. Time seemed to stand still as I locked eyes with the creature at the edge of the forest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Every scrap of knowledge I had about local wildlife told me that this was impossible. Deer don't have forward-facing eyes. Their necks don't rotate like that. This was something else entirely. A memory surfaced, a nature documentary I had watched about prey animals and their defense mechanisms. The narrator had explained how some creatures freeze in the face of danger, their stillness making them harder for predators to detect. In that moment, it felt like the only option I had. I stood motionless, barely daring to breathe. The creature, whatever it was, remained equally still, its unblinking eyes fixed on me. We were locked in a terrifying stalemate, neither willing to make the first move. As the seconds ticked by, my terror began to give way to a strange, detached curiosity. I'd always been fascinated by cryptids and unexplained phenomena. Now faced with something that defied rational explanation, part of my brain kicked into analytical mode. The creature's form was deer-like, but wrong in subtle, unsettling ways. Its proportions were slightly off, its limbs a touch too long and thin. The skin seemed to hang loosely on its frame, as if it didn't quite fit. And those eyes, they gleamed with an intelligence that was decidedly unanimal. I found myself thinking of the stories I had read online, late at night, when I should have been sleeping. Tales of skinwalkers from Native American lore, shape-shifting creatures that could take on animal forms, or the more modern urban legend of not deer, beings that looked almost but not quite like normal deer. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, breaking the silence. The creature's ear twitched, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought it was going to charge. But it remained where it was, continuing its unnatural stare. I knew I couldn't stay on the roof forever. My family would be wondering where I was, and the longer I stayed, the greater the chance that this thing, whatever it was, would make a move. I had to get back to safety, back to the familiar world of reason and logic, where creatures like this didn't exist. Slowly, carefully, I began to edge backwards. My eyes remained fixed on the creature, unwilling to look away for even a second. Each step felt like an eternity, the gravel crunching under my feet, sounding impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. As I moved, the creature's head continued to rotate, following my progress. The sight was so profoundly wrong that I felt bile rising in my throat. No living thing should be able to move like that. It was as if the creature was taunting me, showing off its impossible physiology. I was nearing the edge of the roof, close to where the stairs led back down into the fort. Just a few more steps, and I would be able to make a run for it. My muscles tensed, ready to sprint as soon as I reached the stairwell, and then, without warning, the creature moved. It wasn't the charge I had been dreading. Instead, it took a single step forward, emerging slightly from the tree line. As it did, its form seemed to ripple and shift like heat haze rising from hot pavement. For a split second I caught a glimpse of something else beneath the deer-like exterior, something ancient and utterly alien. That was all it took to shatter my resolve. Primal terror overwhelmed me, and I turned and ran. I no longer cared about keeping my eyes on the creature. All that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance between myself and that impossible thing as I could. I flew down the stairs, taking them 2 and 3 at a time. My foot slipped on the worn concrete, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought I was going to fall. But somehow I managed to keep my balance, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. I burst out of the fort's entrance, gasping for air. The parking lot lay just ahead, and I could see the confused faces of my family turning towards me. I didn't slow down, didn't try to explain. I just ran, sprinting past them towards the safety of our cars. "What's wrong?" I heard my Aunt Kay call out. "Did something happen?" I couldn't find the words to explain what I had seen. How could I describe something that defied explanation? Instead, I just shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "We need to leave," I managed to gasp out. "Please, can we just go?" The urgency in my voice must have convinced them. Within minutes, we were piling into the cars, my family peppering me with questions that I couldn't bring myself to answer. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I twisted in my seat, staring back at the fort. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the tree line, a flicker of something that didn't belong. But then we rounded a bend, and the fort disappeared from view. As we drove home in tense silence, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light and an overactive imagination. But I knew, deep in my bones, that what I had seen was real. The world had changed for me that night. The comfortable certainties of my life had been shattered, replaced by the knowledge that there were things out there that science couldn't explain. Things that lurked in the shadows, just beyond the edge of our perception. I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those impossible predatory eyes staring back at me. And I wondered, with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity, when I might encounter something like that again. The days following our trip to the fort passed in a haze of sleepless nights and anxious days. I couldn't shake the memory of what I had seen. Those unnatural eyes, the impossible movement, the sense of ancient malevolence that had radiated from the creature. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every unexpected sound made me jump. My family was concerned, of course. They had seen my panic that night, witnessed my desperate flight from the fort. But how could I explain what had happened? The words sounded ridiculous even in my own head. I knew that if I told them about a deer-like creature with rotating head and predatory eyes, they would assume I was either lying or had somehow hallucinated the whole thing. So I kept quiet, brushing off their questions with vague answers about getting spooked by shadows or hearing strange noises. I could tell they didn't fully believe me, but they seemed willing to let it go, probably assuming it was just teenage dramatics. My cousins returned to Nevada a few days later, their vacation thankfully unmarred by any strange encounters of their own. As they left, I felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief that they were going somewhere safe, far from whatever lurked in our forests, and guilt for not warning them about what I had seen. But what could I have said that wouldn't have sounded completely insane? With the departure of our out-of-town relatives, life should have returned to normal. But for me, nothing felt normal anymore. I found myself obsessively researching cryptids and unexplained phenomena, spending hours online reading about skinwalkers, wendigos, and other creatures from folklore that might explain what I had encountered. My parents noticed the change in my behavior. They attributed it to typical teenage moodiness at first, but as the weeks wore on and I remained withdrawn and anxious, their concern grew. They tried to talk to me, to understand what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. It was my Aunt Bee who finally broke through my shell of silence. She had always been the family's free spirit, open to ideas and experiences that others might dismiss. About a month after the incident at the fort, she cornered me one afternoon when she was visiting. "Okay, kiddo," she said, fixing me with a knowing look. "Something happened that night at the fort, didn't it? Something you're not telling us." I hesitated, torn between the need to unburden myself and the fear of not being believed. Aunt B must have sensed my uncertainty because she softened her approach. "Listen," she said gently, "I've seen some pretty strange things in my life. Things that most people would say are impossible. Whatever you saw, I promise I'll listen without judgment." Maybe it was the sincerity in her voice, or maybe I had simply reached my breaking point. Whatever the reason, the words started pouring out of me. I told her everything: the eerie silence on the fort's roof, the creature in the tree line, its unnatural movements and piercing gaze. As I spoke, I braced myself for disbelief or dismissal, but Aunt B just listened intently, her expression serious. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Have you ever heard of a flesh gate?" she asked finally. I shook my head, confused. "It's similar to a skinwalker," she explained, "a creature that can take on the form of animals or even humans. But they never get it quite right. There's always something off about them." My heart raced as she spoke. It sounded eerily similar to what I had seen. "Or it could have been a crawler," Aunt B continued. "They're said to be pale, emaciated creatures that mimic other animals. Some people call them not deer when they take on cervine forms." I felt a mix of relief and renewed fear. Relief that someone finally believed me, that I wasn't going crazy. But also fear at the confirmation that such creatures might actually exist. "How do you know about all this?" I asked. Aunt B's eyes took on a distant look. "Let's just say you're not the only one in this family who's had a brush with the unexplained," she said cryptically. "But that's a story for another time." We talked for hours that afternoon. Aunt B shared some of her own experiences with the paranormal and gave me advice on how to process what I had seen. She warned me to be cautious about sharing my story with others who might not be as open-minded. "The world is stranger than most people realize," she told me, "but knowing that can be a burden. You have to find a balance between staying aware and not letting the fear consume you." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Aunt B stood up to leave. She paused at the door, turning back to me with a serious expression. "One more thing," she said. "If you ever encounter something like that again, don't run. Stand your ground. Some of these entities feed on fear. Showing courage can sometimes be your best defense." With that parting advice, she left, leaving me with a lot to think about. That night, for the first time since the incident at the fort, I slept without nightmares. The conversation with Aunt B marked a turning point for me. While I still felt uneasy about what I had seen, I no longer felt so alone in my experience. Knowing that there were others out there who had encountered similar phenomena gave me a strange sort of comfort. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research, but with a more measured approach. I learned to sift through the online noise, separating credible accounts from obvious hoaxes. I started keeping a journal, recording not just my memories of the fort incident, but also any unusual occurrences or feelings I experienced. Slowly, I began to emerge from the shell of fear and isolation I had built around myself. I started spending time outdoors again, albeit with a new awareness of my surroundings. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow at the edge of my vision commanded my attention, but instead of panic, I now felt a mix of caution and curiosity. As summer faded into autumn, I found myself drawn back to the area near the fort. I never went alone, always making sure to have a friend or family member with me. We never encountered anything out of the ordinary on these trips, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. One crisp October afternoon, as the leaves were turning golden and red, I stood at the edge of the forest, near where I had seen the creature. The memory of that night was still vivid, but it no longer held the same paralyzing terror. Instead, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if I was on the cusp of understanding something profound about the nature of reality. As the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, I made a silent promise to myself. I would continue to seek answers, to explore the boundaries between the known and the unknown, but I would do so with caution and respect, remembering Aunt Bee's words about courage in the face of the inexplicable. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. As darkness fell, I turned away from the forest and headed home, my mind filled with thoughts of the mysteries that still lay ahead, waiting to be unraveled. The incident at the fort had awakened something in me, a burning curiosity about the unexplained phenomena that existed just beyond the veil of our everyday reality. As the months passed, I threw myself into research with a fervor that bordered on obsession. My bedroom became a makeshift library of the strange and supernatural. Shelves that once held novels and school textbooks now groaned under the weight of books on cryptozoology, folklore, and paranormal investigations. My walls were covered in maps marked with sightings of mysterious creatures, timelines of unexplained events, and hastily scribbled notes connecting seemingly unrelated incidents. I spent countless hours online, scouring forums and message boards for first-hand accounts of encounters similar to mine. Most of what I found was clearly fabricated or the product of overactive imaginations. But every so often, I'd come across a story that rang true, that contained details that resonated with my own experience. One of these accounts came from a logger working in the forests of northern Washington. He described seeing what he initially thought was an injured deer, only to realize that its proportions were all wrong. The creature's neck had twisted at an impossible angle to stare at him with eyes that were too human, too knowing. The logger's description of the overwhelming sense of dread that accompanied the sighting matched my own feelings that night on the fort's roof. Another report came from a hiker in the Olympic National Park. She wrote about encountering a deer-like creature that seemed to flicker and shift as it moved, as if it couldn't quite hold its form. The hiker had felt an overwhelming urge to flee, describing it as a primal fear, like my deepest instincts knew this thing didn't belong in our world. These accounts, while unsettling, provided a strange sort of comfort. They confirmed that I wasn't alone in what I had experienced, that there were others out there who had glimpsed the same hidden world that had revealed itself to me. As my research progressed, I began to develop theories about what I had seen. The creature's deer-like appearance and its ability to instill paralyzing fear aligned with descriptions of skinwalkers from Native American lore. But its unnatural movements and the sense of wrongness it exuded also fit with more modern concepts like flesh gates or crawlers. I reached out to experts in the field of cryptozoology, carefully crafting emails that walked the line between earnest inquiry and not revealing too much about my personal experience. Most of my messages went unanswered, but a few elicited responses that provided new avenues for research. One particularly intriguing reply came from Dr. Eleanor Reeves, a folklorist specializing in the intersection of indigenous legends and modern cryptid sightings. She suggested that what I was researching might be a manifestation of a much older entity, one that predated human settlement in the area. The Pacific Northwest has a rich history of sightings and encounters with beings that defy conventional explanation, Dr. Reeves wrote. Many indigenous cultures in the region have stories of shape-shifting tricksters or malevolent spirits that can take on animal forms. It's possible that what people are encountering today is a continuation of these ancient phenomena, filtered through our modern understanding and expectations. Her words sparked a new direction in my research. I began delving into the myths and legends of the local indigenous tribes, looking for parallels to my experience. The process was challenging. Much of this lore was not readily available. and I was acutely aware of the need to approach these sacred stories with respect rather than treating them as mere fodder for my investigation. As I dug deeper, I uncovered tales of spirits that lived in the liminal spaces between our world and the spirit realm. These entities were often described as shapeshifters, capable of taking on the forms of animals, but always with some element that revealed their true nature. The descriptions varied from tribe to tribe, but common threads emerged: unnatural movements, eyes that reflected a preternatural intelligence, and the ability to instill a bone-deep fear in those who encountered them. One story in particular stood out to me. It told of a being that appeared in times of great change or upheaval, taking on the form of familiar animals, but always with subtle wrongness that revealed its true nature. The entity was said to be drawn to liminal spaces and times, dusk and dawn, shorelines, the edges of forests. It was a harbinger of transformation, its appearance signaling that the boundaries between worlds were growing thin. The parallels to my own encounter were striking. The fort where I had seen the creature was itself a liminal space, a relic of human activity being reclaimed by nature. The sighting had occurred at dusk, in the boundary between forest and cleared land, and there was no denying that the experience had been transformative for me, irrevocably changing how I viewed the world. As fascinating as these discoveries were, they also brought new anxieties. If what I had seen was indeed some ancient entity, what did its appearance mean? Was it simply a random encounter, or was it drawn to me for some specific purpose? And perhaps most unsettlingly, if the boundaries between worlds were growing thin, what other entities might be crossing over? My research had provided some answers, but it had also opened up a whole new realm of questions. As I sat in my room, surrounded by books and notes, I realized that I had only scratched the surface of this hidden world. There was so much more to learn, to understand. But with that realization came another, more sobering thought. The deeper I delved into these mysteries, the further I moved from the safe, predictable world I had known before. I was walking a path that few others dared to tread, and I couldn't help but wonder where it might ultimately lead me. As the first anniversary of my encounter at the fort approached, I found myself at a crossroads. I could continue down this path of investigation, potentially uncovering more about the true nature of reality, but also exposing myself to dangers I could scarcely imagine. Or I could step back, try to return to a normal life, and relegate my experience to the realm of unsolved mysteries. The choice, I knew, would define the course of my life from that point forward. And as I stared out my window at the darkening sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the gathering shadows, something was watching, waiting to see what I would decide. The weight of the decision before me felt overwhelming. For months, my life had revolved around uncovering the truth behind what I had seen that night at the fort. The research had become more than just a quest for answers. It had become a part of my identity. The thought of abandoning it filled me with a sense of loss, as if I would be turning my back on a fundamental truth about the world. But the path I had been walking was not without its costs. My grades had slipped as I devoted more and more time to my investigations. Friends had drifted away, put off by my constant talk of cryptids and supernatural phenomena. Even my family, supportive as they tried to be, were clearly worried about the intensity of my obsession. As I grappled with my decision, I found myself drawn back to the fort. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when I convinced my reluctant parents to drive me there, promising that I just needed one last visit for closure. They agreed, on the condition that they accompany me and that we leave well before dusk. The fort looked much as it had that fateful summer evening, but my perception of it had changed dramatically. Every shadow seemed to hold potential secrets, every rustle in the underbrush a possible sign of something otherworldly. As we walked the grounds, my parents exchanged worried glances, clearly unsettled by my hyper-vigilant behavior. We made our way to the roof, where my encounter had taken place. Standing there, looking out over the forest where I had seen the creature, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The fear that had dominated my life for so long seemed to recede, replaced by a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. In that moment, I realized that the true impact of my encounter wasn't about the creature itself, or even about proving its existence to the world. It was about the way it had opened my eyes to the vastness and mystery of the universe. There were things out there beyond our understanding, yes, but that didn't mean I had to let the pursuit of them consume my life. As we drove home that evening, I made my decision. I would step back from my obsessive research, try to find a balance between my newfound awareness of the unexplained and the normal life of a teenager. But I wouldn't completely turn my back on what I had learned. Instead, I would carry that knowledge with me, letting it inform my view of the world without dominating it. The next few weeks were challenging, as I worked to reintegrate into the life I had neglected. I threw myself back into my schoolwork, rekindled old friendships, and tried to engage in normal teenage activities. It felt strange at first, almost like play acting at being my old self. But gradually, it began to feel more natural. I didn't abandon my interest in the paranormal entirely. Instead, I found ways to incorporate it into my life in a healthier manner. I joined the school's journalism club, using my research skills to write articles on local legends and historical mysteries. I started a blog where I could share my thoughts on unexplained phenomena, connecting with like-minded individuals in a way that felt less isolating than my previous solitary investigations. As months passed, I found a new equilibrium. The memory of my encounter remained vivid, but it no longer haunted my every waking moment. I could enjoy a hike in the woods without constantly scanning for signs of the supernatural. But I also maintained a heightened awareness of the world around me, an openness to possibilities that others might dismiss. It was during this period of readjustment that I had my second encounter with the unexplained. Unlike the terrifying experience at the fort, this incident was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. But it served as a powerful reminder that the world was indeed stranger than most people realized. I was walking home from school one afternoon, taking a shortcut through a small wooded area. As I moved through the trees, I had the distinct sensation of being watched. I paused, looking around carefully, half expecting to see those unnatural eyes staring back at me from the shadows. Instead, I saw a fox standing perfectly still at the edge of the path. At first glance, it appeared to be a normal animal. But as I watched, I realized that its fur seemed to be moving in a way that didn't match the breeze. It was as if the fox's very form was fluid, constantly shifting in subtle ways. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt a jolt of recognition. There was an intelligence in those eyes that went beyond animal instinct. The fox tilted its head, regarding me with what I could only describe as curiosity. Then, in a movement too quick for me to follow, it was gone, leaving me alone on the path with my racing thoughts. This encounter was different from the one at the fort. There was no overwhelming fear, no sense of malevolence. Instead, I felt a sense of wonder, of having been granted a glimpse into a world that existed alongside our own, rarely seen but ever present. As I continued my walk home, I found myself smiling. The encounter served as a validation of my decision. By finding a balance between skepticism and openness, I had positioned myself to experience the wonder of the unexplained without being consumed by it. That night, I added a new entry to the journal I had been keeping since my first encounter. But unlike the frantic, fear-filled pages that had followed the incident at the fort, this entry was measured, thoughtful, and tinged with a sense of awe rather than dread. As I wrote, I realized that my journey over the past year had changed me in profound ways. I had faced my fears, pursued knowledge in the face of the unknown, and come out the other side with a deeper understanding of both the world and myself. The path ahead was still uncertain, but I felt better equipped to navigate it. The years that followed my decision to find balance were marked by a series of subtle encounters and revelations. Each incident, while not as dramatic as my experience at the fort, added another piece to the puzzle I was slowly assembling. I was 17 when I had my third significant encounter. It was during a school camping trip in the Cascade Mountains, a weekend excursion meant to teach us about ecology and wilderness survival. On the second night, I woke in the early hours of the morning, driven from sleep by an inexplicable sense of urgency. Careful not to wake my tent mates, I slipped out into the crisp mountain air. The camp was silent, shrouded in a thin mist that seemed to muffle even the sounds of the forest. As I stood there, trying to understand what had drawn me from my sleeping bag, I heard it, a soft, melodic sound, unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. Drawn by the haunting notes, I found myself moving away from the camp and into the surrounding woods. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was dangerous, that I should wake someone or at least leave a note. But the pull of that otherworldly music was irresistible. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to lose meaning in the misty pre-dawn light. Eventually I emerged into a small clearing dominated by a towering old-growth cedar. And there, perched on one of its massive roots, was the source of the music. At first glance, it appeared to be a young woman playing a flute-like instrument. But as I watched, transfixed, I realized that her features were constantly shifting, never quite settling into a fixed form. Her hair seemed to merge with the mist around her, and her skin had the texture of bark. She, if she was even the right pronoun, noticed my presence and lowered the instrument. Our eyes met, and in that moment I felt a rush of understanding. This being was connected to the forest in a way I couldn't fully comprehend, a living embodiment of the wilderness around us. No words were exchanged, but a wealth of meaning passed between us. I sensed ancient knowledge, a perspective that spanned centuries. There was curiosity about me, about humans and our brief, frenetic lives. But there was also concern, a wordless warning about the damage we were inflicting on the natural world. The encounter lasted only moments, but its impact was profound. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the mist, the being's form began to fade, merging with the tree and the surrounding forest until I was alone in the clearing. I made my way back to camp in a daze, my mind reeling from what I had experienced. By the time I reached my tent, the rest of the group was starting to stir. No one had noticed my absence, and I found myself unable to share what had happened. How could I possibly explain an encounter that defied rational explanation? This experience marked a turning point in my understanding of the hidden world I had glimpsed. I began to see these entities not as separate from nature, but as integral parts of it. They were the embodiment of wild places, ancient spirits that had existed long before humans and would likely continue long after we were gone. As I delved deeper into this new perspective, I found connections I had previously overlooked. The creature at the fort, the shifting fox, the forest spirit, they were all manifestations of a deeper reality, one that most people never perceived. They appeared in liminal spaces and times, when the veil between worlds grew thin. My research took on a new dimension. I began studying ecology and environmental science, seeing them as keys to understanding the hidden world. I learned about the interconnectedness of ecosystems, the delicate balance that sustained life in all its forms. And I started to understand that the beings I had encountered were guardians of sorts, protectors of that balance. This revelation brought with it a sense of responsibility. If these entities were real, if they were tied to the natural world in such a fundamental way, then the environmental crises we faced took on an even greater significance. It wasn't just about preserving ecosystems or preventing climate change. It was about maintaining the very fabric of reality as I had come to understand it. As I neared the end of high school, my experiences shaped my plans for the future. I decided to pursue a degree in environmental studies with a minor in anthropology. My goal was to bridge the gap between scientific understanding and the ancient wisdom embodied by the beings I had encountered. But even as I prepared for this new chapter in my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that my journey was far from over. The hidden world had revealed itself to me in glimpses and fragments. I knew there was still so much to learn, so many mysteries to unravel. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if my encounters had truly been random. Was there a reason I, out of all people, had been granted these glimpses beyond the veil? Or was I simply in the right places at the right times, open to possibilities that others might dismiss? As I stood on the cusp of adulthood, these questions lingered, promising a future filled with both wonder and challenge. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to face it, armed with the knowledge and experiences that had shaped me over the past few years. The summer before I left for college was marked by an unprecedented heat wave. Forest fires raged across the Pacific Northwest, turning the sky an apocalyptic orange and filling the air with acrid smoke. As I watched the news reports of entire towns being evacuated and ancient forests reduced to ash, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an extreme weather event. My suspicions were confirmed one sweltering August night. I'd been having trouble sleeping, the oppressive heat and the constant worry about the fires making rest elusive. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep entirely and decided to sit out on our back porch, hoping to catch a hint of a breeze. As I settled into a chair, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, I noticed something odd. The tree line at the edge of our property seemed to be moving. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps smoke from the distant fires playing tricks on my tired eyes. But as I watched, the movement became more pronounced. Shapes began to emerge from the forest, shadowy, indistinct forms that seemed to flicker and shift as they moved. With a jolt of recognition, I realized that I was witnessing something extraordinary. The beings I had encountered over the past few years, and perhaps others I had never seen before, were converging. I sat frozen, torn between fear and fascination as more and more entities emerged from the woods. There was the deer-like creature from the fort, its unnatural gaze fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. The fox I had seen on the path darted between the larger forms, its fur rippling in impossible ways. And there, at the edge of the group, was a towering figure that could only be the forest spirit from the mountains, its form seeming to blend with the trees around it. But there were others too, shapes I couldn't quite make out. Beings that seemed to exist in the corners of my vision, vanishing when I tried to look at them directly. The air thrummed with an energy I could feel in my bones, a sense of ancient power gathering. As I watched, paralyzed, a realization dawned on me. These beings weren't here to threaten or harm. They were refugees, fleeing the destruction of their habitats. The fires that were devastating the forests were also driving out these ancient spirits, forcing them into the open in a way I had never witnessed before. Slowly, cautiously, I stood up. As I did, every entity in the gathering turned to look at me. The weight of their combined gaze was almost physical, pressing down on me with the force of millennia. In that moment, I understood that I was being judged. These beings were assessing me, determining whether I, as a representative of humanity, was friend or foe. I took a deep breath, centering myself. Then, drawing on everything I had learned and experienced over the past few years, I addressed the gathering. "I see you," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I understand why you're here, and I want to help." For a long moment, nothing happened. The night was eerily silent, not even the chirp of a cricket breaking the stillness. Then slowly, the forest spirit moved forward. It towered over me, its form constantly shifting between human tree and something altogether alien. A branch-like hand reached out towards me. Without hesitation, I reached back. As our hands met, a jolt of energy surged through me. In an instant, I was overwhelmed with visions, centuries of history seen through inhuman eyes, the slow growth of forests and the sudden devastation of fire, the gradual encroachment of human civilization and the retreat of wild spaces. But along with these images came a sense of purpose, a mission that burned itself into my mind with crystal clarity. These beings needed an advocate, someone who could bridge the gap between their world and ours. They needed someone who could speak for the voiceless, who could fight to protect the wild places that were their homes. As the visions faded, I found myself back on the porch, gasping for air. The gathering of entities was gone, having melted back into the forest as silently as they had appeared. But the weight of their combined knowledge and the urgency of their mission remained with me. That night changed everything. My plans for college and beyond suddenly seemed small and insignificant in the face of the task I had been given. I knew that the path ahead would be challenging, that I would face skepticism and ridicule as I tried to convey the importance of what I had learned. But I also knew that I couldn't turn away from this responsibility. As the first light of dawn began to break over the smoky horizon, I made a vow. I would dedicate my life to protecting the wild places of the world, to preserving the delicate balance that sustained both seen and unseen life. I would be a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, a defender of the hidden world that existed alongside our own. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I could scarcely imagine. But as I watched the sun rise on a new day, I felt a sense of purpose and determination unlike anything I had experienced before. The hidden world had revealed itself to me, entrusting me with its secrets and its survival. And I was ready to answer that call, whatever the cost. As I turned to go back inside, to begin the work that would define the rest of my life, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the forest. For just a moment, I saw the deer-like creature from the fort, its impossible eyes meeting mine. There was a new understanding in that gaze, a recognition of the bond that now existed between us. Then it was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the trees. But I knew it wasn't truly gone. None of them were. They were out there watching, waiting, and I would not let them down. The end of this chapter marked the beginning of a new one, not just for me, but for the hidden world I had sworn to protect. The challenges ahead were daunting, but I faced them with a mixture of determination and hope. For I had seen behind the veil, glimpsed the wonders that existed just beyond our perception. And in doing so, I had found my true calling. As I closed the door behind me, stepping back into the familiar confines of my home, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The adventure that had begun on that fateful night at the abandoned fort had led me here to a destiny I could never have imagined. And though the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, I was ready to walk it, guided by the ancient wisdom of the hidden world and the burning desire to make a difference. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist and casting long shadows across the land. A new day had dawned, bringing with it the promise of challenges and discoveries yet to come. And I was ready to face them all, armed with the knowledge that the world was far stranger, far more wondrous, and far more in need of protection than most people could ever imagine.